Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much to Patrick and Etienne and Valerian for inviting me and putting this together. It's really wonderful to be here and be part of this discussion. And so I want to kick things off with talking about metacognition. So let's start with a definition of what we mean by metacognition. So it's generally thought of as the monitoring and control of other cognitive processes. And so as humans, we don't just have the ability to perceive and remember and decide, but we also have these higher order abilities to become aware of failures in our cognition, to get a sense of confidence that things are going well or badly, and to get a sense of control over our behavior. So metacognition really forms an umbrella term for these kind of higher order abilities. And I think it's fair to say that part of the reason we're all here is that these higher order abilities are a lot less well understood than more primary cognitive processes. And while we know that the accuracy of these metacognitive processes varies even in healthy individuals, part of the motivation for my research is that we also know that inaccurate metacognitive knowledge of cognitive and physical impairments is quite common in psychiatric and neurological disorders. So for instance, an intuitive example is in Alzheimer's disease, patients may lose awareness of the fact that they have memory loss, and this can lead to problems in seeking help or adhering to treatment, for instance. And clinicians often refer to this as insight, and you can think of insight as the capacity for accurate metacognition. So I'm not going to talk about any clinical work today, but this is a link that we're trying to pursue in the future. So in my research, I try and take this approach of developing quantitative measures of metacognition for use in the lab, and then trying to understand the component computations that support these abilities and their associated neural mechanisms. And in the talk today, in the time available, I want to try and cover these four aspects. So to start with, to recap how we can use perceptual decision-making as a model system for understanding metacognition. I'm then going to discuss some dissociations between metacognition and performance that are important to start understanding how things pass psychologically. And then I'm going to move to some newer work where we've been developing a computational framework for understanding metacognitive confidence. And I'm going to finish with some implications of this framework for the neural basis of metacognition, particularly focusing on a recent study that we've done using TMS to try and test some of these implications. So as a model system, we've been using perceptual decisions to understand metacognition. So in these kind of tasks, subjects carry out a difficult perceptual decision here, such as which patch contains more dots, and we can titrate the difficulty of this decision to make it harder or easier. And then after each decision, we ask the subject simply to rate their confidence in getting that decision correct in the absence of any feedback. And we can then use the link between their confidence and their objective performance here as a measure of metacognition. So specifically, if I was to get you to do this task multiple times, I could build up some distributions of your confidence as a function of whether you were actually correct or incorrect on the task. So this is just a cartoon example here. And what we tend to see is that confidence in being correct is higher than confidence in being incorrect. And if you have good metacognition, then these distributions are going to be well separated. Whereas if your metacognition is poorer, even if you're performing the task at a similar level, then these distributions will be more overlapping. And this reflects the fact you're less able to tell apart your own correct from incorrect decisions. And we can quantify this overlap using ROC analysis, so a variant of signal detection theory. And we get a parameter that we call meta D prime, which reflects the overlap between these distributions. So we can quantify performance using D prime or just percent correct on the task. And then your ability to discriminate your own performance with meta D prime. And an important thing to point out is that meta D prime is theoretically independent of your average confidence level on the task. So in this cartoon example, both these subjects have the same mean confidence. What's important here is that the subject on the bottom has a better metacognitive ability than the subjects on the top. So in our initial work on this, in this area, we focused on individual differences in meta D prime. And so I'm just pooling data over a number of studies here. And I've ordered subjects by their meta D prime. And so in blue, you have metacognition, meta D prime. And in green, you have percent correct on the perceptual task. And this is around 170 subjects. And the point of this slide is to really point out that meta D prime is decorrelated from performance. And there's also plenty of individual variability. So you get this normal distribution in the population of metacognitive ability on these simple perceptual tasks. And we've seen in a number of studies now a convergent evidence that the structure and function of the anterior prefrontal cortex, particularly the rostrolateral sectors, so BA10 and parts of area 46, are related to individual differences in metacognition. So subjects with greater grey matter volume in the APFC have better metacognitive ability. White matter microstructure in the anterior corpus callosum, so areas of white matter tracts that are connected up to APFC, are related to metacognition. Functional connectivity between the APFC and other areas of the brain, again, related to metacognitive ability. And we've also done some recent work looking at how metacognition changes over the lifespan, increasing in adolescence and decreasing in older age. And this is indirect link, but it is consistent with the idea that metacognition depends on prefrontal integrity. Now, obviously, all this is correlational. So in recent work, we've been trying to identify dissociations between metacognition and performance. And that's what I want to turn to next. So in this study, we collaborated with some neurosurgeons at NYU to identify patients who had lesion overlap with BA10. And there's a lot of heterogeneity in the lesion location here, but the subjects were recruited into the study as long as their lesions did overlap with either right or left BA10. And we tested the subjects on both the perceptual decision task that I've just outlined, and also we included a memory task where the task here was to do an old-new recognition judgment after learning a list of words, and they were asked whether the word on the left or the right was on that previous list, and then to rate their confidence in their decision. And so in both the perceptual and the mnemonic tasks, we can calculate task performance and meta D prime. And we included this task as a more exploratory measure to see whether any metacognitive deficit that we expect to observe, is it domain general or is it specific to particular domains? And so we had a group of healthy controls, a group of APFC lesion patients whose data will be in red, and a control group of patients who had lesions to the temporal lobe of a similar size, and we didn't have any hypotheses about any metacognitive deficits there. And so the first thing we can do is just look at the performance on the task, so the percent correct. And on the left here, you've got the perceptual data. On the right, you've got the memory data. And as you can see, initially, the first thing to point out is that all the groups are performing well above chance, where chance is this 50% line. And there's also no significant differences between the lesion groups on primary performance. The other thing to point out is that the perceptual task, we control the difficulty of the perceptual task using a staircase procedure. So we can also check whether that difficulty parameter varies across the groups. And again, there's no differences. So this is this parameter in the inset here. Also, when we look at mean confidence across the groups, so we just take simply the average of your confidence ratings in the task, also no difference between the groups or across the tasks. But what we're interested in is not the average confidence or the average performance. We're interested in the link between these two things. So how well can your confidence ratings discriminate your own performance on a trial-by-trial basis? So to get at that, we compute meta D prime for each group. And when we did that, we observed a quite striking deficit in the APFC group, and so on the perceptual task. So here, just to orient you, this ratio of meta D prime over D prime should be 1 if subjects are using all the available information to rate their confidence. And so the two control groups are slightly below this optimal prediction. We often see this in these perceptual tasks, but they're not significantly different from it. Whereas the APFC group have an almost 50% drop in their metacognitive accuracy, despite being able to perform the task just as well as the other groups. Now, when we then turned to the memory task, we were pretty surprised because actually there was no deficit in metacognitive ability on the memory task in the APFC group. And so we still don't really understand this result. We have hints from some imaging data in healthy controls that neural substrates of metacognition for internally generated information, such as arises from memory, may be quite different. So Hak-Kwan Lau has done some interesting work on this. And we're currently following this up with functional imaging to compare these domains. But the main conclusion is really that this provides a causal test of ideas that the APFC are really involved in metacognition in these simple decision tasks. So the the answer is, the question then is raised, well, why? Why are these reasons involved? And to start addressing this, we've been focusing on this middle box here, which is to try and understand in more detail what are the component computations that go into making these confidence judgments. So it also makes some potential implications for how metacognition in these perceptual tasks may work at a neural level. And so specifically, we've been thinking about the reason why you might need to represent things at a higher order level in order to carry out this confidence computation. And so one interesting idea is that the role of the higher order prefrontal areas here is to integrate both state and action information. And that is consistent with what we know about the anatomical connectivity of anterior PFC. So it receives projections from both higher order perceptual areas in the anterior temporal lobe. It receives projections from cingulate motor areas and also from other prefrontal regions. And so one idea is that the reason that you get metacognitive impairments when you have lesions here is that it's impairing your capacity to integrate at a higher order level. Another prediction we can make is that action information in the premotor cortex should independently contribute to confidence reports. And so this is something that we've been testing recently using TMS. So the idea here is that a key distinction between the first and the second order models is that in the first order models, confidence and actions just arise from this perceptual variable, whereas in the second order models, it really reflects this higher order integration of state and action information. So if we can TMS the premotor cortex at the time that you make your decision, that might then have downstream consequences for confidence. So we did this recently in a study with Hak-Kwan Lau. And so the study here was, the task was, again, a perceptual decision task, slightly different. Here, the subjects are deciding whether a grating stimulus was either horizontally or vertically oriented. And the contrast of this grating was made low enough such that this was quite a difficult decision. And we titrated the contrast for each subject individually, so they're all performing around a similar level. And then the task was to use your left or right hand to respond horizontal or vertical. And we counterbalanced the response assignments across subjects. And then after this response, you had to rate your confidence on a scale of 1 to 4. Now, the key manipulation here is that around the time of your decision, either a few hundred milliseconds after the stimulus, but before you decide, or immediately after you've decided, we give a single pulse of TMS to the premotor cortex. And this pulse was given for each subject consistently either in the right or left hemisphere. Now, what this means is post hoc, we can then sort the trials according to whether the pulse was congruent or incongruent with the action that the subject actually made in the task. Now, because the response here has nothing to do with the perceptual information that you're actually using here, then this manipulation is theoretically independent of the strength of the perceptual information here. So the idea is that if the motor system is contributing information to your confidence reports, then when the pulse is incongruent with your action, that should impair your metacognitive ability. So the first thing to check is to what extent this pulse affected your primary performance. Now, quite gratifyingly for us, in a number of studies, we find that this small single pulse doesn't affect your actual performance. So this is sorting the percent correct on the task by whether the pulse was before or after the response, and according to whether the TMS pulse was congruent or incongruent with your response. And we also had a no TMS control condition. So there aren't any significant effects on performance. If anything, there's a slight boost in performance on the incongruent condition, which is important because we actually observe the reverse in metacognition. So if anything, performance is going in the opposite direction to what we observe with metacognition. So as I just said, gave the game away a bit, but we get a significant impairment in metacognitive ability when the pulse, the TMS pulse, is incongruent with the action you make. And this is strongest in the pre-TMS condition, so the TMS pulse applied just before the response. And so we can unpack this a bit further, and we can look at what's driving this decrease in metacognitive ability. So when we plot out the subject's confidence ratings as a function of pulse, we see this is the overall picture. I'm going to show you lots of individual data panels down here, but the overall picture that we see is that the incongruent pulse serves to squash in confidence on corrects and error trials, and that results in this inability to distinguish whether you've made a correct or erroneous judgment. And so we replicated this effect in 2 separate experiments, so it's quite robust. We have the same effect when subjects are doing a contrast discrimination task as when they're doing an orientation discrimination task. And the predominant effect is this squashing in of confidence in the pre-decision TMS condition. So we think that this is initial evidence that there is a key role of the motor system in confidence reports in perceptual decision tasks. Now, this is potentially consistent with the notion that confidence reflects a higher order integration of state and action information. And so to conclude, I've shown you that individual differences in metacognitive ability are linked to the structure and function of the anterior prefrontal cortex. Lesions to this region impair metacognitive ability specifically for perceptual decisions, and this is potentially consistent with a role in multiplexing state and action information. First-order models of confidence are insufficient for various reasons, and instead we think that metacognition may be operating as a higher-order inference on the causes of one's own behavior. This can accommodate both error monitoring and confidence data. And one implication of this framework is that action information plays a key role even in perceptual confidence, and that we've recently been testing this to demonstrate that the motor system contributes to confidence independently of perceptual information, and that's consistent with metacognitive inference. And so I just want to finish by thanking a number of collaborators, specifically Nathaniel Dorr, who I've been working very closely with on the theoretical framework, and Illy van der Putten, who was the master's student who collected the behavioral data on that pre-post motion experiment. And thank you very much for your attention.